Hello everyone, and again thank you for your patience this morning as we wait for our latecomers there. We're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who haven't met me or spoken with me before with customer success, my name is Ann Schaefer. I am the Senior Customer Success Specialist here at MarketSight. We are happy to discuss some of the new features that have been added to the MarketSight application, especially those coming that are related to charts and Excel. In terms of today's session, we're looking at a relatively short session, maybe half-hour maximum. Again, once we cover these features, we're going to take some questions. For those questions that are related to the session that we can answer on the line, we certainly will do so. If there are specific questions that you have, or perhaps they may not be related to the topic at hand, we'll certainly make sure that we follow up with you by email. The session, of course, is being recorded as well, so no concerns there. We will have that posted as well after the session finishes today. All right, so going to go ahead and move on to our next slide here. So we have a number of changes that have taken place with the most recent update, and we split them essentially into the three sections we're going to cover today. One of the first things we'll take a look at, of course, would be related to crosstab changes. Things like the freezing of the column headers, for example, are definitely good ones there. We have some Dataset Labeling Workbook changes. Now, if you've never worked with the Dataset Labeling Workbook file, this could be an interesting area for you to take a look at. This is essentially an Excel workbook that serves as a metadata file, particularly handy for Excel-based users, but it's also still useful for SPSS users as well now, and we'll show you why. Finally, we'll be taking a look at some of the new customization options that are available in charting. So for those of you who'd like to get very specific about certain attributes in the charts, things like the title position, for example, all of that can now be changed. And this also contributes then to, say, making new dashboards, because you can further refine the look and feel of all of the items in the dashboard. All right, so let's take a look now at MarketSight. And I'm going to move over to the variables page to bring up the Dataset Labeling Workbook. Now, in the past release, not the most recent one, but the one actually that came out a few months back, the Dataset Labeling Workbook received a major update that you may be aware of. And that is, it is now possible to actually export a pre-filled copy of the Dataset Labeling Workbook here. So if you've uploaded a dataset, you can always come to this particular option, and that's going to load that tasks list, of course, on the far side. Once that's complete, let's go ahead and open that up here, and we're going to take a look at some of the contents. Now, of course, the first thing that you'll notice as we look at this particular worksheet is that I have all of this information filled out. So these are all of the variables, of course, that are in my data set. This makes it possible for me to make very convenient changes. So, for example, if I wanted to, say, remove the word have from all of these variable labels, it's, of course, very easy to do find and replace in Excel, and then reapply this workbook to the data set. Now, the 11.1 change that we've made in particular is a little further down the line here. So we're going to go ahead and scroll down to this bottom of the workbook here, and you'll see down here that all of the user-defined variables that have been created in this particular data set have all been listed here. Now, this may not seem like a big deal, but here is why it actually is. First, you can use this as the basis for making new user-defined variables from scratch without actually using the point-and-click interface. So for those of us who may be more familiar with typing up syntax or code and prefer that method, this can be a way to do that. Second, if you are working, for example, with conditional variables, you will probably know that if you need to do something like modify the position of parentheses within the conditional, it can be somewhat challenging at times. This method makes it much easier. As you can see in this particular case of this conditional variable here, I actually have my logic for each of my individual values laid out right here. Now you can of course see the parentheses there, so it's no stretch to imagine simply being able to type in an extra set of parentheses as needed and then apply this to the workbook. Now of course you may be wondering what happens should you make an error. That may well happen, we're all human, and in that case it's actually not too bad. What you'll find is that when you upload the workbook, should it contain an error, say for example, I remove that parentheses there. Well, That's an error technically because the parentheses isn't closed. The rest of the workbook will apply, so other changes that I've made in other variables, that should still apply. I will actually get a warning note that's going to tell me where the error in my logic is, so that way I can go back and fix that and then apply the workbook again. So this is really the way in which the workbook now becomes useful not only for Excel users, but again also for those users who may be working with, say, complex conditionals, or even SPSS who may wish to make lots of variable labeling changes in one go. So definitely something to keep an eye out if you do have situations like that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this, not saving that particular workbook file. Now there are a few other things that I do want to point out in terms of applying that workbook to a previously uploaded data. So once you've made changes, that's also a very simple process. I'm opening the Datasets tab in a new window here, and I just want to point out that the way to do it is to simply right-click on your dataset and look for the Properties option. Once you find the Properties option, you'll then see that there's a box to replace the Dataset Labels file. You would simply browse for that Excel Dataset Labeling Workbook, and then when you click OK, it's applied to the dataset. I have upload warnings because I applied a workbook with flawed logic on purpose, so just to let you know. All right, switching back here to the variables page. One last thing to mention that has changed in recent updates. This is a shortcut that was added actually in 11.0, so not the most recent update, but the one previous to that, that not many people know about just yet. So let's say, for example, of course, we have our traditional age variable here, and we wanted to make a regrouped version of that. The usual approach, as we are no doubt all familiar with, is to go to New, Regrouping Variable. And at this point, of course, I need to fill out the dialog. So I might say, choose the category I want it to go in. And then I simply need to search for that predecessor. So at this point, this is all fairly standard. However, a new shortcut has been added. The key is simply right-click on this blank area in the correct variable row. So if I want to regroup age, for example, I'm going to right-click in that blank spot next to it, choose Create UDV, and then you'll see an option, of course, same menu. When I choose Regrouping Variable, what's key about this shortcut is that not only does it pre-populate the category, it's going to choose the same category that the predecessor variable was located in, but it also pre-populates that variable drop-down here. So I no longer actually have to do the search. Not that it took that long in the first place, but of course every second can count, especially if you're doing this operation repeatedly. So just one shortcut to keep in mind there to speed up your workflow every little bit. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and cancel out of this dialog now, and we're going to head to the crosstabs page, where I'm just going to put together a pretty simple crosstab here, nothing too exciting, shall we say. We'll grab some variables and we'll stick those into the rows here. When we stick those into the rows, I think we do definitely want a column header or two here. So I'm going to place in age groups into my columns, and we're ready to go. Now, with this particular crosstab, I'm going to close the editor for a moment, we can see that it happens to be longer than my screen, so of course I have to scroll. And at this point, I don't know about you, but being that I'm a human being with flawed memory, I often forget what these columns actually were by the time I get down this far in the crosstab. Therefore, I have to go back up, find out what the columns were, and then go back down in the crosstab. Well, we've solved that problem. So what you're looking for in your crosstab is a checkbox here in the gray toolbar. This will freeze the column header. So now, when I scroll down, as you might have guessed, my column headers stay put. So I no longer have to go, all right, what was the column over here? It's actually still there for me, so it's easily visible, and I know what it is. So in terms of usability, a simple change, but one that's very handy. Now, one thing to keep in mind about this new feature here with the freezing of the panes, this particular option that you see in the gray toolbar is a crosstab specific feature, we'll say. So if I set it here, This particular checkbox only influences this individual crosstab. But of course, there are situations, and frequently you may be making crosstabs that are long all of the time. So if you are making lengthy crosstabs on a regular basis and you don't want to have to click this checkbox every time, simply take a look underneath your name in the upper corner. You'll see that there's an options section here, and you'll find that there is a freeze column header section there as well, a freeze header option, I should say. If you set it in your default settings here, in your options, that makes it the new default for all of your crosstabs going forward. As a result, in any crosstab that you make, you will have the frozen column headers by default. All right, so now another new feature that has been worked on and added with this new version is the ability to go ahead and actually nest these variables in the rows. So I'm going to go ahead and move back into the editor here. All right, and now that I am back in the editor, let's go ahead and take a look at some of our options for that. So we've heard a number of users with their feedback, and we do definitely appreciate that feedback. So we're actually working on improving this experience even now. But currently, the way this works, as of today anyway, is that if I want to nest a variable in my rows, I simply need to drag and drop that variable onto the row variable, as you might have guessed. So let's say I'll do something simple like gender for the moment, drag it on top of my row variable there, and I'll get my nested table. Now, the feedback that we've gotten is that's great, but of course it can be challenging if you want to insert that variable in between these two variables, for example. Right now, there is a workaround for that, and that is to add it to the bottom of the tab, and then simply move that variable up with the arrows here. However, of course, because your feedback is important to us, what we're working on is making it so that it's possible to just drag and drop it much more easily in between variables as needed. So that should be coming shortly, and that will be an additional refinement to the nesting in rows. All right, so those are the changes to crosstabs. So let's take a look at some of the new formatting options that are available with charts. Heading off to the charts page now, and let's say we'll pick a simple chart here. This one isn't very complex. That's certainly fine for our purposes today. Now, with this chart, this interface, of course, hasn't really changed, but there are some new options tucked in here and there. So I'm going to hit Edit. One of the first things to be aware of is on the Display tab. Now, this particular chart, I'm going to turn on the option to show the sample size. And I can see that in this case, the sample size is 617, and normally that would be perfectly fine. But let's say, for the purposes of the examples today, that I needed a set threshold of, say, 700. Well, I can actually put in a warning message if my sample size happens to be below whatever threshold I define. So, in this case, now that it's below my set threshold of 700, I actually get that warning message appearing. This can be formatted so the message itself can be changed, and I can also use it as a footnote message. So if you would prefer not to obscure the chart, but rather simply to give a warning down below the chart, that's also certainly feasible. Now, other options that have been added are also going to be available on this Display tab. So I'm going to scroll back up just a tad here. I had mentioned in the very beginning, title, and that, of course, has now been customized further. So centered has been the default for many, many years. It's now, of course, possible to put it to the left, to the right, or even custom placement. So if you decided to get visually interesting here, you'll note that when you choose custom, it turns into an object, and this object can then be clicked and dragged and moved around. So if I wanted to place this, say, in the middle, maybe on the bottom here, something like that, for example. That's now doable as a result of that custom positioning. Other formatting changes that have been added are things like the padding. Now, you may be wondering, what the heck is that? Fair enough. The padding is actually referring to the, invisible, really, space that exists between the chart object, which is sort of indicated, of course, by the axis here, and the edge of the chart box itself. So right now, that padding is at 0. However, if I change that, say, let's put in 60 pixels worth, it's going to actually resize that, and as you can see, that chart has now gotten a little smaller, and that margin, that padding here, has gotten larger as a result. This may seem esoteric, but for those of you who are working more and more in dashboards, this can actually be very, very handy for getting those dashboard charts arranged just so. So something to keep in mind there. Now another thing that can be done is the ability to change the background color of the chart itself. So right now, that background is clear. However, that said, don't have to stick with that. As you can see, we can choose from any color or even pick custom colors as is normal. So let's say I wanted to choose perhaps, let's say a nice shade of blue, and we'll lighten that up just a tad. We'll hit apply. Great. Now that I have these sorts of changes made, when I save, of course, that's going to be something that will show in a subsequent dashboard, and this sort of change will also export. I'm going to take this padding back down to 0 here, just for the sake of, I think, having maximum space for the chart, and I am going to hit export, and for the moment, I'll leave it on the standard template. I'm going to click OK, and as before, that's popping up that list here on the far side. When that task is complete, as always, I will get my PowerPoint presentation that I'm able to open and say modify, use any sort of add-ons that I might typically work with in PowerPoint. All right, opening that up here. All right, so it looks like here's my chart. It seems my blue color didn't come over, perhaps because I didn't check the option, but that's okay. I'll simply need to make sure that I do that next time. Now, as mentioned, this is fully functional, so if you want to go in and edit the data, for example, that is present underneath this chart. So I could say shorten this label, for example, and then of course that's going to be represented in the labeling immediately in my document. So let's say, again, anything like that we can change. All right, and again, any sort of PowerPoint add-on you would typically use is functional at this point because you are now working with a PowerPoint object. All right, going to go ahead and close that. I'm not going to save that guy. So that brings us back to our slides here. And again, just in summary of the different areas that we've covered, we've mentioned some of the crosstab changes, both current and upcoming, things like freezing the panes and nesting the row variables. The Dataset Labeling Workbook changes that we've made, so filling out UDVs, for example. And then, of course, some of the formatting options that are now available for charts. At this point, we're going to take a look at the questions that have come through to see if we can answer any of those. And give me just 1 second to take a look and run through those here. One moment. All right, so it looks like we have a couple that aren't too specific here. The first one is, can I format my chart by default? That is, can I not have to set these settings every single time? That's certainly doable. Let me switch back to MarketSight here briefly. And if you take a look on the charts page, there are two different ways that you can consider that section. So I'm going to head out here. The first is that we have a templates page. So if you want to make these chart settings your default so that you're not changing them frequently, consider making a PowerPoint template. Your alternative is again to go to your name and look at your global options. You'll see that there's going to be a series of tabs under the charts option here where you can set many of those changes as well. All right, so we do have a couple of other questions pertaining to the release. One that I do want to mention here, question ID is not showing up with these stubs. So this one is one that I've noticed. This is actually going to be resolved this week, so you shouldn't worry. We're going to have those question codes out with the variable labels themselves. So that's going to be working shortly as exactly you expect. All right, and any last questions here that we can see? All right, we do not yet have freezing row headers, but that's a brilliant idea. So I'm going to add that in to our feature request log, and maybe we'll get that in shortly. All right, so that looks to be about it. The remainder of the questions are fairly project-specific, so we'll go ahead and follow up with everyone by email. Thank you so much for attending our training today on the different new features that are available in 11.1 for Excel and charts. Thank you and have a wonderful day.